The 300-pound inmate planted himself directly in Mike Tyson's path, chest puffed out, arms wide, blocking the corridor like a human wall. Tyson stopped walking, looked up at the man who had 6 inches and nearly 100 pounds on him, and didn't blink. What happened in the next 30 seconds would become prison legend, a story whispered about in every cell block, every yard, every intake unit for decades after. But before we get to that moment, you need to understand something. When Mike Tyson walked into the Indiana Youth Center in March of 1992, he wasn't just another convict. He was the most feared puncher on the planet. A man who had knocked out grown men in under a minute. A man who made opponents quit on their stools before the bell even rang. He had been the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. He had earned over $300 million. He had shaken the hands of presidents and kings. And now he was wearing a beige jumpsuit, carrying a bedroll, and walking into a place where none of that was supposed to matter. Believe me, it mattered. See, prison has its own economy, its own politics, its own food chain. And at the very top of that chain sits one currency that buys everything else: reputation. Not the kind you build on magazine covers, the kind you build by making someone bleed in front of witnesses, the kind that tells every other man in the building not to test you. So when a man like Tyson walks through those doors, every single person behind those walls has a decision to make. Do I stay out of his way, or do I try to become the guy who put Iron Mike on the ground? Most chose option 1. Most were smart enough to understand that fame and fighting ability aren't always the same thing, but in this case, they absolutely were. Tyson wasn't famous because he was charming. He was famous because he could separate your consciousness from your body in less time than it takes to sneeze. But there's always one. Get this. There is always one guy who thinks the math works differently for him. The man blocking Tyson's path that first day was known on the block as Big Rick. Nobody called him Richard. Nobody called him Ricky. You called him Big Rick, and you said it with respect, or you said it with blood in your mouth. He stood 6'4", weighed somewhere north of 300 pounds, and had been running his section of the facility for the better part of 3 years. He had hands the size of dinner plates, he had a neck thicker than most men's thighs, and he had a reputation that inside those walls was every bit as feared as Tyson's was outside them. Big Rick had put men in the infirmary. Big Rick had made grown men cry. Big Rick collected commissary payments from half his unit, and the guards looked the other way because keeping Big Rick happy meant keeping the block quiet. He was the ecosystem. He was the weather. And he had decided, before Tyson even arrived, that this was going to be his moment. Here's what nobody tells you about prison hierarchies. They don't work on logic. They work on display. A lion doesn't become king of the jungle by writing a resume. He becomes king by walking into the open and daring something to challenge him. Big Rick understood that. The moment he heard Tyson was being transferred in, he saw an opportunity that most men wouldn't even dream of. Beat Tyson, and you don't just run a cell block. You run the whole facility. You become untouchable. You become a story that outlives your sentence. So he waited. He positioned himself in the corridor that every new inmate had to walk through during intake processing. He leaned against the wall, arms folded, watching as the guards escorted Tyson toward his assigned unit. And when Tyson got close enough, Big Rick stepped into the center of the hallway and didn't move. The guards noticed. 2 of them exchanged a glance, and their hands moved instinctively toward their belts. But they didn't intervene. Not yet. I swear this happened. They wanted to see what would come next. Maybe they were scared. Maybe they were curious. Maybe they just understood that in this world, some things had to play out. Tyson stopped about 4 feet from Big Rick. He was still holding his bedroll. His eyes moved from Big Rick's face down to his planted feet and back up again. There was no surprise in his expression. No fear. If anything, there was something that looked a lot like recognition. He'd seen this before. Not the man, the situation, the test. Big Rick spoke first. "So you're the big bad Mike Tyson?" Tyson said nothing. He shifted the bedroll from his right hand to his left. "You don't look so tough to me," Big Rick continued, taking a half step forward. "In here you ain't no champion. In here you're just another number. Now listen. Most people, when they hear a story involving a confrontation, they imagine 2 men standing still and talking trash for 5 minutes while dramatic music builds. That's the movies. That's not how it works in real life, and it's definitely not how it works when one of the men involved is Mike Tyson. Tyson dropped the bedroll. That was the only warning, the only signal, the only moment between the world Big Rick had been living in and the world he was about to enter. 1 second, the bedroll was in Tyson's left hand. The next second, it was on the concrete floor, and in the half-breath after that, Tyson moved. He closed the 4-foot gap so fast that Big Rick didn't even get his hands up. Tyson stepped inside Big Rick's reach, which is the one place a bigger man never wants a shorter, faster fighter, and drove a straight right hand directly into the center of Big Rick's chest. Now this is where you need to understand something about Tyson's power. Here's the thing. Professional heavyweights, the ones who had trained for months specifically to absorb Tyson's punches, went down from single shots. Men with neck muscles conditioned by years of sparring. Men wearing padded gloves that distributed the impact. Men who knew the punch was coming and braced for it. They went down. They went stiff. They went to hospitals. Big Rick was not a professional heavyweight. Big Rick was not wearing protective equipment. And Big Rick absolutely did not see it coming. The punch landed with a sound that witnesses later described as something cracking. Big Rick's feet actually left the floor. Not by much, maybe an inch. But when you weigh 300 pounds and both feet leave the ground at the same time, something extraordinary has just happened to you. Big Rick staggered backward. His shoulders hit the wall behind him, and for a moment his eyes went completely blank. Not unconscious, not yet, but somewhere between here and gone. His knees buckled, straightened, buckled again. His mouth opened but nothing came out. Tyson didn't follow up, that's important. He didn't swarm in with combinations. He didn't jump on top of the man and start swinging. He just stood there, hands at his sides, watching Big Rick try to remember what planet he was on. The entire hallway had frozen, the guards, the other inmates being processed, the trustee mopping the floor 30 feet away who had stopped mid-stroke with his mouth hanging open. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Big Rick slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor. His legs were splayed out in front of him, his chest was heaving, and there was something in his eyes that everyone in that corridor recognized immediately. Fear, not anger, not embarrassment. Fear. Pure, primal, physiological fear. The kind that rewires your brain in real time and tells every cell in your body that the thing standing in front of you can end you whenever it wants. Tyson bent down and picked up his bedroll. He stepped around Big Rick's outstretched legs, and he kept walking toward his assigned cell without looking back. No words, no threats, no victory speech, just footsteps on concrete, getting quieter as he moved down the hall. And that was it. That was the whole fight. One punch, maybe 2 seconds of actual contact, over before most people in the hallway even processed what they'd seen. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that's the end of the story. Big Bad Tyson comes in, knocks out the bully, everyone learns their lesson, roll credits. But that's not where this goes. Because what happened after that single punch is actually the part that became legendary. The punch was just the introduction. Word travels in prison the way fire travels through dry brush. By the time Tyson reached his cell, the story had already hit 3 different units. By dinner, every inmate in the facility knew what had happened. And by lights out, the story had already started to grow. Some versions said Tyson knocked Big Rick cold with a left hook. Some said he hit him 3 times before Big Rick even blinked. One version, and I heard this from a guy who was actually there, claimed Tyson caught Big Rick's fist out of the air and punched through it. That one's not true, but the fact that people believed it tells you something about the energy Tyson carried. For his part, Tyson went through the rest of his first day without incident. He ate dinner alone. He made his bed. He sat on the thin mattress and stared at the ceiling. A guard who worked that unit later said he checked on Tyson around 11 that night, and Tyson was just sitting there in the dark, perfectly still with his eyes open, not sleeping, not reading, just sitting. The guard said it was one of the most unsettling things he'd seen in 15 years on the job. Get this. The next morning, Tyson was in the yard by 7. He found a patch of concrete away from the weight pile, and he started doing calisthenics, push-ups, sit-ups, burpees, shadow boxing, moving with a speed and precision that made every single person in that yard stop what they were doing and watch. Now here's the thing about the yard. The yard is where alliances get built and territories get marked. Different groups claim different areas. The weight pile belongs to one crew. The basketball court belongs to another. The benches along the south wall, the picnic tables near the commissary window, the patch of grass by the fence. All claimed, all defended. Tyson walked into the yard and picked a spot. Nobody told him where to go, nobody waved him over. He just walked to an open piece of concrete and started moving. And within 10 minutes a circle of empty space had formed around him. Not because anyone was told to move, just because everyone instinctively understood that the space around Mike Tyson belonged to Mike Tyson. Now remember, Big Rick. You might think he disappeared from this story after that hallway encounter, that he crawled back to his cell and spent the rest of his sentence avoiding eye contact. That would be the simple version. Trust me, it's not what happened. Big Rick spent 2 days in the infirmary, not because of the punch to his chest, though the medical staff said he had deep tissue bruising across his sternum. He spent 2 days there because the warden wanted to keep the two men separated while things cooled down. Smart move, on paper. But here's the problem with trying to cool things down in prison. Prison doesn't cool down. Prison simmers. When Big Rick came back to general population, he was different. The swagger was gone. The broad-shouldered walk that used to clear hallways now looked more like a man trying to take up less space. His voice, which used to boom across the cafeteria, had dropped to something closer to conversational. The commissary payments stopped. The intimidation stopped. Everything that had made Big Rick the king of his block had been dismantled by a single punch from a man 6 inches shorter than him. And everybody noticed. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody expected. Not the guards, not the inmates, not even the warden. About a week after the hallway incident, Tyson was eating lunch alone in the cafeteria, same as every day, when someone sat down across from him. Big Rick. Now picture this. The entire cafeteria went silent. Forks stopped moving. Conversations died. Every set of eyes in the room locked onto that one table, because either this was about to be round 2 or it was something nobody had ever seen before. Big Rick put his tray down, looked at Tyson and said, "I deserve that." Tyson stopped chewing. He looked at Big Rick for a long time. Then he said, "Yeah, you did." And then Big Rick said something that, according to 3 different people who were sitting close enough to hear, changed the way every inmate in that facility thought about both men. He said, "I've been the biggest guy in every room my whole life. I never had to learn how to be anything else. You showed me that big don't mean nothing." Here's where it gets real. Tyson put down his fork, and for the first time since he'd arrived, his expression softened. Not a smile, not warmth. Something quieter than that. Something that looked, if you were watching closely, like understanding. "I know what that's like," Tyson said. "Being one thing your whole life and not knowing how to be anything else." Now you need to remember who Mike Tyson was at this point in his life. This was a man who had lost everything. His title, his marriage, his freedom, his mentor, Cus D'Amato, had been dead for years. The people who were supposed to protect his money had stolen most of it. The woman he loved had taken the stand and told the world he was a monster. He was 25 years old, and he was sitting in a prison cafeteria in Indiana with nothing but a conviction and a reputation. And in that moment, sitting across from a man he'd put on the ground 3 days earlier, Tyson showed something that the cameras and the headlines and the pay-per-view broadcasts had never captured. Humanity. Big Rick nodded slowly. He picked up his fork, and the 2 men ate lunch together in silence, not as friends, not as enemies, as 2 men who understood something about each other that nobody else in that room ever could. Now mark my words, that's not the end either. Because what happened over the following months is what turned this from a prison fight story into something people still talk about 30 years later. Tyson and Big Rick didn't become best friends. This isn't that kind of story. But they developed something that the prison staff started calling an understanding. Big Rick stopped trying to run his block through fear. He started using his size for different things, breaking up fights instead of starting them, helping the older inmates carry things. Standing near the guys who were getting targeted by predators, not saying anything, just being there. Being a wall that the predators didn't want to walk into. And Tyson noticed. About a month in, a guard found Tyson in the gym at 5 in the morning, hitting a heavy bag that the facility had installed after his arrival. The guard asked him how he was holding up. Tyson stopped punching, and without looking at the guard, said something that the guard later wrote down in a personal journal because he couldn't believe it came out of Mike Tyson's mouth. "Everybody in here is fighting something. Most of them just don't know how to do it with their hands. Think about that. This is the man who bit Evander Holyfield's ear off. This is the man who told reporters he wanted to eat Lennox Lewis's children. And here he was, at 5 in the morning, in a prison gym in Indiana, showing more insight into the human condition than most philosophers manage in a lifetime. Over the months, Tyson settled into a routine. He trained every morning. He read books in the afternoon. Cus D'Amato had taught him early that a fighter's most important muscle was between his ears, and Tyson devoured everything he could find: history, philosophy, politics. He read about Alexander the Great and Machiavelli and Sun Tzu. He read about men who conquered the world and men who lost everything and men who came back from the dead. And here's what you won't read in any official report. Tyson started teaching, not officially, not in any program approved by the warden, but inmates started showing up to the gym in the mornings, first 1 or 2, then 5, then a dozen. They'd watch Tyson work the bag, and eventually someone would ask him to show them something: how to throw a jab, how to keep your hands up, how to move your feet so you don't get caught flat. Tyson showed them, patiently, carefully, with more gentleness than anyone expected from a man who could crack ribs with a body shot. Big Rick was one of them. The man who had tried to intimidate Tyson on day 1 became one of his most dedicated students, and he wasn't learning to fight. Not really. He already knew how to use his size to hurt people. What Tyson was teaching him, without ever saying it directly, was discipline, control, the difference between power and destruction. One morning, about 4 months into Tyson's sentence, a younger inmate, skinny kid, maybe 21, made the mistake of trying to steal from one of the older men in the unit. The older man caught him and was about to beat him senseless when Big Rick stepped between them. Not with threats, not with violence. He put one massive hand on the older man's chest and said, "Not today." The older man looked at Big Rick, then looked at the space behind him where Tyson was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, watching. The older man walked away. Now listen. Nobody will tell you that Tyson's time in prison was some kind of fairy tale. It wasn't. There were bad days. There were days when the rage that lived inside him, the rage that Cuss had spent years teaching him to channel into his fists, came out sideways. He had confrontations with guards. He had moments of darkness that the people closest to him during that period describe with careful, measured words and long pauses. But the hallway incident with Big Rick set a tone that lasted for the entire 3 years Tyson spent behind bars. Nobody tested him again, not once. The one-punch takedown of the facility's most feared inmate had established a boundary so clear and so absolute that it didn't need reinforcing. And Big Rick, the man who had tried to make a name for himself by stepping to the most dangerous fighter alive, he served out the rest of his sentence without a single disciplinary incident. When he was released in 1994, the same year as Tyson, he reportedly told a fellow inmate, "That man taught me more with one punch than my father taught me in 18 years. Now, if you've made it this far into this story, you're clearly someone who appreciates the kind of content we make on this channel. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. We've got stories coming that will make this one feel like a warm-up. Tyson walked out of prison on March 25, 1995, after serving 3 years of his 6-year sentence. A crowd of supporters waited outside. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. The world was waiting to see what version of Mike Tyson would emerge from behind those walls. He stepped into the sunlight, squinted, and took a deep breath. Somewhere behind him, inside the facility he'd just left, his legend was still growing, still being told, still being passed from one inmate to the next, getting bigger and stranger and more impossible with each telling. But the real story, the true story, wasn't about the punch. It never was. It was about what happened after the punch. It was about a man who had every reason to become a monster behind bars and instead became something nobody expected: a teacher. When reporters asked Tyson years later about his time in prison, about the fights, about the confrontations, about the stories that had become bigger than the truth, he said 7 words that carried more weight than any punch he ever threw. "I learned more than I taught." That was it. No elaboration, no dramatic pause for follow-up. Just 7 words from a man who had knocked out 44 professional fighters, who had terrified every human being who ever shared a ring with him, and who had walked into one of the most dangerous environments in America, and walked out 3 years later having left behind something nobody expected. Respect. Not the kind built on fear, the kind built on the understanding that strength means nothing if you don't know when to use it and when to put it away. Big Rick learned that lesson on a cold concrete floor in a corridor in Indiana, and Mike Tyson, the baddest man on the planet, learned it right alongside him.